Keanu Reeves had always believed in the power of kindness. It wasn't about grand gestures or fame, it was about seeing people, truly seeing them. But on one particular evening, outside a luxury restaurant, he came across a young girl whose words would shake him to his core. What she revealed would change everything. Hey there, before we dive back into the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We've got another amazing story coming your way tomorrow. The evening was cool, and the streets were alive with the soft hum of the city. People dressed in fine clothes entered and exited the luxury restaurant, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Keanu had been inside for a quiet dinner, hoping to enjoy a rare peaceful moment. But as he stepped outside, something caught his eye. A young girl, no older than 10, sat on the sidewalk just outside the restaurant. Her clothes were slightly worn, and her small hands clutched a tattered notebook. She wasn't begging, nor did she call attention to herself. She simply sat there, her eyes fixed on the pages, writing carefully under the dim streetlight. Keanu hesitated for a moment. He had seen poverty before, had witnessed struggle up close. But there was something different about her, something that made him stop. Curiosity and concern pushed him forward. He crouched down beside her, his voice gentle. "Hey there, what are you writing?" The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were big and bright, filled with something that wasn't quite sadness but wasn't joy either. She blinked at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to speak. "Stories," she finally said. "I like writing stories." Keanu smiled. "That's amazing. What's this one about?" The girl hesitated before holding up the notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, though some words were scratched out and rewritten. "It's about a man who helps people," she explained softly. "Even when no one knows who he is." Keanu felt a strange pull in his chest. "That sounds like a wonderful story. Why did you choose to write about that?" The girl shrugged, looking down at her notebook. "Because I know what it feels like to wish for help." Her voice was quiet, but the weight of her words was heavy. Keanu's heart ached. He glanced around. There was no adult near her, no one watching over her. "Are you here alone?" he asked gently. She nodded. "My mom works late. She cleans offices. I wait here for her sometimes." Keanu's chest tightened. A little girl, sitting outside a fancy restaurant, writing stories while her mother worked late into the night. The contrast was painful. "Where do you live?" he asked. The girl bit her lip, hesitating. "We stay in a small room. It's not ours. Someone lets us sleep there for now." Keanu exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had met many people in his life, had heard countless stories of hardship, but something about this little girl struck him deeply. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't complaining. She was just sitting there, writing about kindness, even when life had been so unkind to her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie," she replied. Keanu smiled. "That's a beautiful name, Sophie. Do you have everything you need?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Mom does her best. She tells me that things will get better." Keanu looked at her, at the quiet strength in her small frame. "Do you believe her?" Sophie met his gaze and, after a long pause, she nodded. "Yes. Because she never gives up." Keanu swallowed hard. The weight of her words sat heavy in his heart. At that moment, the door of the restaurant opened, and a well-dressed couple stepped out, laughing about something. They barely glanced at Sophie as they walked past. Keanu turned back to the girl. "Do you like books?" Her face lit up. "I love them. But we don't have any." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. It wasn't much, just something he used to jot down thoughts. He flipped to a blank page and wrote something down. When he was done, he tore out the page and handed it to her. She took it carefully, reading the words. Her eyes widened. "This is a bookstore?" she asked, confused. Keanu nodded. "It's a place where they love stories as much as you do. If you go there tomorrow and show them this note, they'll let you pick out as many books as you want." Her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper. "Really? Really," Keanu assured her. "Stories belong to dreamers like you." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she clutched the note to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu smiled softly. "And one more thing, when you grow up and become a famous writer, promise me one thing." She wiped her eyes quickly and nodded. "What?" "Write a story about your mom. Because she sounds like the real hero." Sophie's lips trembled, and she nodded again, unable to speak. At that moment, a woman came rushing down the street, her eyes frantic. "Sophie!" The girl turned. "Mom!" Her mother, dressed in a simple cleaning uniform, reached them, her breath short from running. "I told you not to stay out too late," she scolded, though her voice was more worried than angry. Keanu stood up as the woman looked at him. Her eyes widened slightly when she recognized him. "I was just keeping her company," Keanu said kindly. The woman looked at her daughter, who was still clutching the note. "Sophie, what is that?" The girl beamed. "It's for books, Mom. He's getting me books." Her mother's eyes filled with emotion. She looked at Keanu, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu shook his head. "You already have." The woman swallowed hard, then reached for Sophie's hand. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home." Sophie looked up at Keanu one last time. "I promise I'll write that story." Keanu grinned. "I know you will." As they walked away, Sophie turned back and waved. He waved back, watching as they disappeared down the street. For a long time, Keanu stood there, thinking that in a world full of noise, of wealth and fame, of luxury and excess, a little girl had reminded him of what truly mattered. And as he walked away into the night, he carried with him the quiet hope that somewhere, someday, Sophie's words would change the world. Keanu Reeves stood there for a long time, watching Sophie and her mother disappear into the distance. The city lights flickered, the sounds of traffic and laughter filling the air, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the way Sophie had clutched that piece of paper as if it were a treasure, the way her mother's eyes had filled with both gratitude and exhaustion. Something about them stayed with him. Most people would have walked past Sophie without a second glance. She wasn't begging, she wasn't causing trouble, she was just existing, quietly, on the edge of a world that barely noticed her. And yet, despite everything, she had been writing stories. Not about her pain, not about her struggles, but about kindness. Keanu shook his head slightly. A girl like that, someone with such a big heart, deserved more. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He made a quick call to a friend who owned the bookstore he had written the note for. "Hey," Keanu said when the call connected. "There's a little girl named Sophie who's going to come by tomorrow. Let her take as many books as she wants. Put it on my tab." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Of course." Keanu exhaled, feeling a small sense of peace. But something still didn't sit right with him. Sophie and her mother were living in uncertainty. She had said they stayed in a room that wasn't even theirs. How long would they have that place? What happened when they had to move again? The thought made his stomach twist. He had spent years keeping his own life simple, giving away most of what he earned to charities and people in need. He never did it for recognition, he did it because he had known loss, had known what it felt like to struggle. And tonight, as he thought about that little girl sitting alone outside a luxury restaurant, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He called another number, this time reaching out to someone who specialized in helping struggling families find permanent housing. "I need you to look into something for me," he said. "There's a mother and her daughter in a tough situation. They need a safe place to stay." The person on the other end agreed immediately, promising to look into options. Keanu ended the call and let out a slow breath. Maybe it wouldn't solve all their problems, but it was a start. The next morning, Sophie woke up early, the piece of paper still clutched in her hand. "Mom, we have to go to the bookstore," she said excitedly. Her mother, still exhausted from work, gave her a tired smile. "Are you sure, sweetheart? Maybe we should save that for another day." But Sophie was already grabbing her shoes. "Please, Mom. He said I could have as many books as I wanted." Her mother hesitated, looking at her daughter's hopeful face. How could she say no? So they went. When they arrived at the bookstore, Sophie hesitated at the door. It was bigger than she had imagined, filled with endless shelves of books. She had always wanted to step inside but had never dared. She turned to her mother, eyes shining. "Do you think it's really okay?" Her mother nodded, squeezing her hand. "Go on." Sophie stepped inside, clutching the note like a golden ticket. She walked up to the counter and hesitated before handing the paper to the clerk. Keanu Reeves gave me this. He said I could have books." The woman behind the counter read the note, then smiled warmly. "You must be Sophie. We've been expecting you." Sophie's jaw dropped. "You have?" The clerk nodded. "Go ahead, pick anything you like." For the next hour, Sophie wandered through the store, pulling books off the shelves, running her fingers over the covers as if they were treasures. Every story she had ever dreamed of reading was right there, waiting for her. Her mother watched from a distance, her heart aching with both happiness and disbelief. How could a stranger, someone as famous as Keanu Reeves, be so kind? She shook her head, wiping a tear from her cheek. Meanwhile, Keanu was on another call, making sure Sophie and her mother wouldn't have to worry about where they would sleep. When he finally got confirmation that a small but safe apartment had been arranged for them, he let out a breath of relief. He didn't want them to know it was from him. It was never about that. It was about making sure they had a chance to breathe, to live without fear of being forced back onto the streets. Later that day, he got a message from his friend at the bookstore. "Sophie just left. You should have seen her face. She picked more books than she could carry." Keanu smiled. That night, Sophie sat in her tiny room, surrounded by books. She ran her fingers over the covers, unable to believe they were really hers. She picked up a pen and opened her notebook to a fresh page, and then, she began to write a story about a man who helped others, even when they didn't ask. A story about kindness, about hope. A story that, one day, she would share with the world. And somewhere, far from the little room she called home, Keanu Reeves smiled, because he knew that the best stories didn't just come from books, they came from real-life moments, from kindness, from believing in people who just needed someone to believe in them first.